So yes, today I will be trying to describe the fictionality of video game players' actions, and I will be using the actions we perform when playing Tetris or the flipping of Tetrominoes as a kind of test case for the description. So when we play video games, we can save little sisters, we can help our team members, we can kill orcs or race spacecraft. But of course, when players say they are doing these things, they are not actually performing all these actions. In video game studies and the philosophy of video games, authors often talk about fictional actions when talking about actions as these. But not a lot of authors are very explicit in what they mean with the concept of fictional actions. So I want to see what exactly fictional actions are and what we might mean when we talk about them. So a lot of authors like Grant Havener, Chris Bateman, Robson and Meskin use a kind of Waltonian framework when talking about fictional actions. Kendall Walton wrote My Mises as Make-Believe in 1990, and his theory of make-believe seems very applicable to video games, although he never talks about them in his book. He does talk about performing fictional actions with regard to children's games of make-believe. So his most famous example is that of two children in the forest playing a game in which they pretend tree stumps to be bears. Walton calls the tree stumps props because they prompt imaginings about the existence of bears in the forest. Because the tree stump is a physical prop, they also make actions possible. For example, if the children run away from a tree stump, they use their real action and themselves as props to imagine that they are running away from a bear. Walton would say they are then fictionally running away from a bear. Walton says that all our interactions with representational works or fictional works involve this kind of game of make-believe. For example, if we look at a painting of a boat, we are looking at a fictional boat, and Walton would say that we make-believedly look at a boat. So that is, we are fictionally looking at a boat when we look at a painting of a boat. So this theory about fictional actions of Walton seems applicable to video games because just like the children run away from a tree stump and pretend of their real action, that it is the fictional action of running away from a bear, video game players press certain buttons and create certain representations on a screen, for example of a zombie being shot, and pretend of their real actions, that it is actually the shooting of a zombie, a fictional action. So using Walton, we could define the fictional actions of video game players as real actions of manipulating a controller and thereby creating a graphical representation on the screen, which are used as a prop to imagine they are really doing the represented action, which is then the fictional action. There is, however, one problem with this application of Walton to video games, and it is that flipping a tetromino in Tetris would also be a fictional action. Because a player presses a certain button, creates a representation of a turning tetromino, and pretends of this real action that it is a flipping of a tetromino, which would be a Waltonian fictional action. As Robson and Meskin say, in Walton's sense, perhaps all video games would be fictions. And Tetris would not only be a fiction because it involves representation, but also because it involves imagining to be manipulating tetrominoes. This is because Walton wasn't really interested in fiction as such, but with representation in general. So if we look at which video game actions would be fictional according to the used Waltonian framework, it would be almost all of them. Also moving chess pieces in virtual chess, flipping tetrominoes in Tetris, and maybe even, problematically, opening a menu. Because a player presses a button and pretends of his button press that it is actually an opening of a menu, which would then be a fictional action. So authors actually want to define only a subset of these actions as fictional actions, which is why the Waltonian framework is often referred to, but then neglected or just rejected. So these authors have a problem, because then why should we call shooting zombies a fictional action but not flipping tetrominoes? It seems that we are in need of a condition that is fulfilled by shooting zombies but not by flipping tetrominoes, which would allow us to call shooting zombies fictional but flipping tetrominoes non-fictional. So I went to look for such a condition. A first one might be hinted at by Grant Tavener in The Art of Video Games. He says that the possibility of fictional action comes about when various elements of the fictional environment are given the potential to cue game events, or what we might call affordances for action. A fictional affordance in the case of a video game is thus an interactive aspect of a fictive representation that determines what a player can fictionally do. So maybe, based on this statement, we could say that a player's action is fictional only when it is enabled by a fictional affordance versus a rule-based affordance, or by an action possibility that is part of the fictional environment of the game. It is clear that Grant Tavener here is influenced by Jasper Jules' idea that games are built up out of fictional and rule elements. So maybe we can only say an action is fictional when it is caused by the fictional elements of a game. This would of course solve having to call Tetris actions or the opening of a menu fictional, because those are just reactions to rules of the game and not the fictional world of the game. But I do see some problems with this condition. First of all, what exactly are fictional affordances? Tavener calls them affordances that are part of the fictional world, but then we can ask, what exactly is a fictional world? Tavener describes fictional worlds as worlds with imagined existence only. But then the question is, why would a world in which blocks fall down and stack and disappear when they are on one line not be a fictional world? Because it only exists in our imagination, right? From a broad Waltonian perspective, Tetris would indeed have a very limited but a fictional world. And Tavener actually concedes that Tetris is an ambiguous case and it is very hard to establish whether it's fiction or not, or whether it has a fictional world or not. The second problem I see with the description of fictional actions as reactions to fictional affordances is cheating. In a game like Uncharted, we can stand next to walls and move in very strange ways to actually face through the wall, which is called wall clipping. So Tavener would actually agree that wall clipping is a reaction to a rule-based affordance, because in the fictional world of the game, Nathan Drake, the character you are playing, is a solid human being and he can't walk through walls. The fact that we can walk through walls in Uncharted is only a consequence of an exploit, a bug in the coding or a bug in the rules of Uncharted. But I don't see a reason why not to call wall clipping a fictional action. I don't see why shooting a zombie is different from walking through a wall in Uncharted. The only difference is that shooting zombies is actually supposed to be something that you do in the game, while wall clipping is a kind of what Walton would call an unofficial make-believe game to play when playing Uncharted. So I think the description of fictional actions as reactions to fictional affordances doesn't really do the job I wanted it to, and that's not a criticism to Tavener because he didn't mean it like that, because it just exchanges the problematical distinction between fictional and non-fictional actions for the equally problematical distinction between fictional and non-fictional affordances. Now luckily, Tavener hints at a second possible condition to distinguish non-fictional and fictional actions. He says that in games without player characters, the player directly manipulates the fictive qualities of the game without taking on a role in the world. He describes the avatar as the player's fictional proxy in the world of the game. So maybe we can only be said to act fictionally in video games when we act through an avatar. This is also how Robson and Meskin interpreted Tavener's statement. But they react kind of harshly to it. They say that it is ridiculous to say that no fictional actions are possible when there is no overtly represented avatar in a game, and they use the example of Wipeout to show this. Wipeout is a racing game and it doesn't really have an avatar as such, but it is still possible to perform fictional actions in Wipeout because players say that they are speeding or shooting missiles, etc. So Robson and Meskin certainly seem to be right when they say no overtly represented avatar is necessary to perform fictional actions, but their example might be somewhat unfortunate. Because of course, Wipeout is a racing game, and it seems very clear that you need to identify with the driver of the spaceship if you are playing this game. Maybe what is necessary to perform fictional actions is not an overtly represented avatar, but just a fictional proxy, someone in the world of the video game you can identify with. So to test this, we should look at games who don't even have fictional proxies or fictional roles the player is mandated to imaginatively fill. And Tavener gives us examples of these games, for example Tetris, Age of Empires, Rise of Nations, The Sims, etc. In games like these, the players are granted agency not through an avatar, not even as an implied character in a fictional world, but just as themselves. That is, these players are performing actions as themselves, so their actions are not part of the fictional world of the game. To me, it thus seems silly to call them fictional, because these players are just, like Tavener said, directly manipulating the fictionally represented world from the outside. But of course, this doesn't have to convince you. I only said that an external perspective makes fictional actions impossible, and Walton wouldn't really be impressed by this. So a possible Waltonian objection is that even if you are taken on an external perspective, you are acting on a fictional object, and that means that you are fictionally acting. So Walton says that you are effing a fictional, and you can fill in any verb here. If you are, maybe I should have chosen another letter. Effing a fictional X, then you are fictionally effing that X. So, for example, if you look at a painting of a boat, you are looking at a fictional boat, and thus you are fictionally looking at a boat. The same would be true for Tetris. If you are flipping a representation of a tetromino, you are flipping a fictional tetromino. This would mean you are fictionally flipping a tetromino. But this is not necessarily true, I think. And to show this, I will be using a child's game of make-believe. So imagine a child playing with a doll, and imagining the doll to be a toddler. So the child also imagines that this toddler can walk on his own. So the child does not imagine herself to be part of the fictional world she is imagining. So when she imagined the toddler to walk on his own, she is pushing the doll. That is, she is pushing the fictional toddler. But that doesn't mean she is fictionally pushing the toddler, because in the fictional world of her game, the toddler is walking on its own. She is just not part of the game. So the new condition I'm actually suggesting is that video game players can only be set to perform a fictional action when they imaginatively project into the situation of someone or something who does F in the fictional world of the game. This would of course solve the Tetris case, because no one in the fictional world of Tetris, if you would agree that Tetris has a fictional world, is flipping Tetrominoes. So there's no such fictional action as flipping Tetrominoes in Tetris. Same would be true for The Sims. If you send a sim to the toilet when playing The Sims, you are making it fictionally true that the sim goes to the toilet, but you're not fictionally making this true, because in the fictional world of the game, no one is forcing the sim to go to the toilet. So there's no reason to talk about a fictional action here. So what is interesting about this is that video games can be used as a criticism to the theory of Kendall Walton. According to Walton, appreciators of works of fiction always enter the fictional worlds of the work they appreciate and make things fictionally true about themselves when they appreciate this work. This is clear, for example, when someone is looking at a painting of a boat and thus makes it fictionally true of themselves that they are seeing a boat. Video games, however, introduce a whole new way of entering fictional worlds and making things fictionally true about ourselves in this world. This is also why Robson and Meskin call video games self-involving interactive fictions. We really identify with a character within the fictional world, and the actions performed by this character are actions we say to perform ourselves. So if you see a representation of a zombie in Uncharted, it might be true that you are fictionally seeing a zombie, because this action is made possible by the fact that you identify with Nathan Drake, who really is in the fictional world and who really sees the zombie. But if you are seeing a tetromino in Tetris, there's no reason to say that you are fictionally seeing a tetromino, because no one in the world of Tetris is observing the falling Tetrominoes. What you are doing is actually just looking at the representation of a Tetromino. So it is interesting that an element of Walton's theory that made his theory especially applicable to video games, namely the idea that we enter the worlds of the works we appreciate, is now the same element that makes it impossible to distinguish between games such as Uncharted, which are self-involving, and games such as Tetris, who are not self-involving, and who, which don't cause us to imagine something about ourselves at all. So what I suggest now is that we use this new condition of fictional actions only being performed when we imaginatively identify with someone in the fictional world, and combine it with Walton's description of fictional actions. This way, Walton's overgeneralization will be worked out, and we still have a kind of Waltonian explanation of what it exactly means to perform fictional actions. So the actual description I suggest, and this is very much a work in progress, so all comments are welcome, is that a video game player performs a fictional action F when the player imaginatively projects into the situation of someone or something in the game world who does F, by performing a real action such as the manipulation of a controller while watching the screen, which the player then uses as a prop to imagine that she, in the guise of a fictional proxy, is doing the action. The conclusion of my conclusion would then be that when playing Tetris, we might be making it fictional that Tetrominoes are flipped, but we are not fictionally flipping Tetrominoes. Thank you.
In what was almost a speed run of that talk, we now have lots of time for discussion. Yes.
Yeah. Silver button. And it's on. I have a few questions and comments. Sorry for that. First of all, I think that the whole world fiction approach is by now vastly contested in game studies, and I'm curious why you went with Walton's fictional world instead of something like Thomas Pavlov's fictional world, or Dolichow's heterocosm, or just the concept of diegesis. Why that is what can explain fictional action. But also, I was wondering whether you tried to apply to this way of thinking Esmond Orset's distinction between fictionality, virtuality, and that which is real. In his Doors and Perception paper, I think he makes kind of initial comments on how we have to explore the ontological status, not just of objects, but also implies some sense of action.
Yes.
And finally, I just came to think of in Jesper Juul's half reel, when he talks about fictional worlds, he does it in a very vague way, right? Which is at times problematic, but he talks about how games that emphasize fictional worlds rely on metaphorical substitutions in the tasks that we perform as players. So I wrote down the quote from his book where he states, in games that emphasize a fictional world, there has to be a metaphorical substitution between the player's real-world activity and the in-game activity performed, which very much, I don't know if it solves the problem of the whole, is it avatar-based, is it not, is it that how do we describe this, but that it becomes very different in a setting in Skyrim, maybe, than from abstract games that we might call concrete games. I don't know if that was a proper order of saying things and asking questions, but I think this is a very interesting topic, but also something that is easily objective towards, at least from the theoretical.
Okay, so the reason why I chose Walton is definitely because I come from a philosophy of fiction background, and Walton is still pretty big there. And also because I noticed that Chris Bateman, Grant Avner, and Robson and Meskin wrote a lot on video game actions and used Walton to describe them at first, and then kind of Walton disappears from their story without explicit mentioning of why. And Arset's article, I think, was very interesting because indeed it gives this other perspective. But then again, what really annoyed me was the definition of fiction he uses. Which is, I think, is a very simple dictionary.
That which doesn't go away when we stop believing in it.
Right.
Or a lie.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So within the philosophy of fiction, it would be unthinkable to talk about fiction that way. And people still kind of rely a lot on Walton when talking about fiction. So I thought maybe we just need a better definition of fiction, and that will work things out. But then, of course, you have the typical Waltonian problems, which I tried to discuss here. About the jewel, I also already forgot the quote, but I think that also in that book, it's a big problem that he keeps talking about fiction without really saying what he's talking about. So from the perspective of philosophy of fiction, that's really annoying when researching video games, that no one really has a theory of fiction to back it while they are talking about fiction.
Thank you.
Further questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, I have a question about what do you think about the fictional, non-fictional actions of the scenario of multiplayer shooter games where where players really do a fictional action which is delegated to the fictional proxy, but at the same time we are fully aware that we are playing in a game as we are communicating with the teammates and things like that. What do you think about that scenario? Are they considered fictional action, non-fictionals, or hybrids of both?
Yeah, I think I definitely try not to talk about multiplayer games too much because it's so confusing. But I think that they are definitely more real in the sense that maybe you are not playing the same make-believe game. When you shoot someone in a multiplayer game, you might not be doing it because you want to fictionally kill them, but just because you want to have a higher score or just annoy that person or something like that. So it really depends on the make-believe game you are playing, I think.
Further questions, comments? John Richard.
I just read a paper which introduces a scenario pseudo-fiction, I think. So that, I don't know, but perhaps that could be another option, because
Okay.
you have the rule system and then you have the representation of make-believe player. And because those systems are in conflict, so in gameplay you just ignore fiction. Something like the newest example is Mario has 3 lives. Is that a probably fiction or not? So perhaps that is what's happening here as well. Is that it's sort of a half fictional that you are performing a rotating action in that race. It doesn't quite fit with the fact that you imagine that you are doing it in the game, but you don't sort of care about it. I don't know, is that,
Okay. Yeah, that would be interesting. Pseudo-fiction. I will look into that.
Any further questions or comments? Yes.
Okay, really simple question, and I'm thinking here of a slightly different tradition in the philosophy of fiction that goes back more to Lewis and Kripke. Can I use myself as a proxy? Can I myself be a proxy without requiring any act of identification between myself and something within what I guess you refer to as the game world? I'm thinking that Tetris is a really interesting liminal case. There's certainly nothing in what's depicted on the screen that's a Tetromino flipper. But can I see myself as a contestant in some sort of game, even as I stand out here with my controller? Wouldn't that be sufficient for you?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because, again, it depends on the make-believe game you are playing. And I said when playing The Sims, you are kind of not involved in the world of the video game. But I know a lot of players who actually use themselves as a kind of proxy when playing The Sims. For example, they pretend to be a kind of evil god in the world of The Sims who just like puts Sims in a pool and then puts the ladder away and then their Sims drown. And they really kind of identify with an evil god in the game, but they just do so as themselves because there's no avatar or nothing to identify with. So yeah, in that sense, you can use yourself, I guess, as a fictional proxy. Maybe even more clearly in VR, because there you kind of become fictionalized, but you're still yourself within the fictional world.
So just very quickly, are there any games where you would definitively rule out that possibility? Does it seem less plausible to you for Tetris, for example?
Well, it seems less plausible to me, but it is, of course, possible if you play an unofficial make-believe game in which you think that you are somehow part of the fictional world, then yes, you might be set to perform fictional actions. I think the other way around, it's much harder. If there is a clear character you have to identify with to play the game, it's very hard not to. So if you play Uncharted not pretending to be Nathan Drake, that would be harder than pretending to be someone in the fictional world of Tetris.
No final questions? Yes, Rune.
Yeah, I have a quick. Thank you. It's a very interesting presentation, and this question has been dealt with also earlier in the conference series. Jon Rikard, you didn't mention it yourself, but you could check out his 2012 on in-game action, which comes from a different direction, but which I guess can be put into some productive dialogue with this, either in this work or in a later, a different work. I guess my question is about the specificity of computer games, so video games, because it seems to me that maybe your take on it that you suggest so far could be equally applicable to, and is more about games with a sufficiently ambitious representational aspect. It could be a very complex story-based board game, for example. So, am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then my question would be: would there be any way of trying to look for development of this proposal that you're doing that somehow also tries to account for this strange kind of physicality that Tetris is sort of borderline an example of, but that you find much more fully fledged in other games. This sense of relating to something physical that is not physical, because some will try and theorize that as a matter of fictionality, some will refer to it as virtuality, some will just say synthetic reality. There are. So I guess my question would be, what's your take on that kind of physicality, which you don't have in a sophisticated story-based board game, for example?
So yeah, I think the beauty of using Walton, despite all the problems with his theory, is that you can go very broad and really discuss any kind of game in this way. Especially his prop theory makes it possible to talk both of fictional and virtual objects as objects we imagine something about and objects that might make something true about ourselves. So definitely I think it's very possible to broaden this theory to also explain board game actions or something like that, yeah.
Thank you. And with that, I would close the discussion and thank Nele once more for a wonderful talk.